"Does Brian come in today?" she asked, tone even, like she was inquiring about shampoo. There was a pause. A chuckle. "He's always here early. You thinking of switching careers, Kezia?" "Maybe just the scenery," she replied and hung up. By 9 a.m., she was walking into Salon Mirage again, not in power heels or designer blazer, but in jeans and a soft grey hoodie, hair pulled back. Brian was already at the corner mirror, wiping it down, earbuds in, bobbing his head to some beat only he could hear. She stood behind him for a second before he noticed her in the reflection. He froze, pulling one earbud out. "You again?" he smiled, not hiding the surprise in his eyes. "Don't flatter yourself," she said, but there was a twinkle in her gaze. "I forgot my confidence." He put the towel down. "Well, lucky for you, we have plenty of that here. Right between the conditioner and broken dreams." She laughed. It came out lighter than she expected. "Walk with me?" she asked. Brian blinked. "Seriously?" She nodded. "It's either that or I pretend I needed another blowout to see you again." They left together, two figures stepping into the hum of the city. The streets were drying up, people rushing past, but inside their pace was slow. They talked about music, bad haircuts, favorite smells. She told him about Paris, where she once lost her way but found her ambition. He told her about Cabrera, where his brother still lived, and how drawing was the one way he'd ever silence the noise. At a quiet park bench near the art center, Kezia sat while Brian pulled a pencil from his pocket. She raised an eyebrow. "Again?" "Different angle this time," he said. "You're not guarded today." She looked away, her voice dropping. "That's because I don't know what this is yet." He sketched anyway. "Me neither. But it feels better than most things I do understand." Just before the sun dipped behind the tall buildings, Kezia's phone rang. A sharp ringtone, a name she couldn't ignore, Board Chair Lionel. Her hand hovered over the screen. She declined it. Brian noticed but said nothing. That night, Kezia didn't return to her penthouse. Instead, they sat on the rooftop of Brian's small apartment, legs dangling over the edge. There was a bottle of cheap wine between them, and city lights blinked around like stars that had gotten lost. He told her how he once entered a national art contest but never submitted because he didn't think anyone would understand what he was trying to say. She turned to him slowly. "What were you trying to say?" "That no matter how strong someone looks, sometimes they're just tired of being armor." She was silent for a long beat, then leaned over and kissed him, gently like she was thanking him for something she hadn't yet named. But perfection doesn't last without interruption. 3 days later, the tabloids found the sketch. A blurry photo of it hanging on Kezia's fridge, leaked by Myra, who had visited under the guise of a girls' night. Headlines popped up within hours. Corporate queen romantically linked to broke artist. Investors called. Board members panicked. Her assistant's voice trembled as she delivered the news. At the salon, Brian was folding towels when Kezia stormed in. He stood, smiling. She didn't. "You shouldn't have drawn me," she said, tone sharp. "This wasn't supposed to be public." He blinked. "I didn't make it public." "But it became public. And now everything I worked for is..." She stopped herself, chest rising and falling. "I see," he said after a moment, quietly. "It was real, until it got inconvenient." She didn't answer, just turned and left. That night, she sat in the dark of her penthouse, glass of wine untouched, staring at her reflection in the giant windows. But this time, the woman looking back felt unfamiliar. Cold. Alone. Down in his apartment, Brian tore up every sketch of her. Except one, the very first. The one where she looked like someone remembering how to smile. A week passed. Then 2. Neither reached out. The city moved on. The headlines faded. But nothing filled the silence. Until one afternoon, Madame Grace called Brian out to the front of the salon. "Delivery," she said, cryptic. A small wrapped canvas sat on the counter. No note. No signature. Just a card that read, "Sometimes, you find your real reflection in someone else's eyes." He unwrapped it. It was a new sketch. Him leaning over, sketchpad in hand, eyes alive. He laughed, then cried, then grabbed his coat and ran. Across the city, Kezia stood in the gallery she had quietly rented for the night, surrounded by blank walls except for one drawing, his. He walked in, breathless. She turned. "I'm tired of mirrors," she said. "They show me who the world wants to see. But you showed me." He walked up, took her hand. "And you showed me I didn't need to be rich to be valuable." "You really see me," she whispered, almost surprised by her own words. Brian shrugged modestly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I see more than just what's on the surface. Most people don't bother." Kezia's eyes softened. "Why? Why do you care?" He looked away for a moment, then back at her, his voice low and honest. "Because I know what it's like to feel invisible, to want to be understood without having to explain everything." She nodded slowly, the weight of her high-powered life suddenly feeling heavier in comparison to his simplicity. "I think I've been hiding behind masks for so long, I forgot what it felt like to just be." Brian stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Maybe you don't have to hide anymore." She laughed quietly, the sound surprising even herself. "That's easier said than done." "Nothing worthwhile ever comes easy," he replied. "But it starts with one step." Kezia glanced around the salon, the familiar surroundings now feeling different, warmer, more alive. She looked back at Brian and saw not just the assistant or the artist, but someone who might show her a new way to live. Their eyes met again, lingering longer this time, as the noise of the salon returned. Yet in that moment, a quiet promise was made, unspoken but felt deeply. Later, as Brian returned to his duties, Kezia found herself watching him from her chair, the sketch folded carefully in her lap. She wondered how two worlds so different could collide in such a small place and create something unexpectedly beautiful. Kezia felt a flutter she hadn't noticed in years, a mix of excitement and something more fragile, like hope. She tucked the sketch into her purse just as Brian returned with a warm towel, his hand steady now but his eyes betraying a hint of nervousness. "So," she began, voice soft, "when did you start drawing?" Brian glanced down, rubbing the back of his neck. "As a kid. It was easier to talk through pictures than words. Especially when the world felt too loud." Kezia smiled, relating more than she wanted to admit. "I know what that feels like." Minutes stretched as they exchanged stories, hers of boardrooms and cold corporate smiles, his of small studios and late-night inspirations. Around them, the salon buzzed with conversation and laughter, but they were wrapped in a quiet bubble. Myra caught their lingering glances and gave Kezia a teasing nudge. "Careful, Kez. This could turn into a full-on romance." Meanwhile, across town in a cramped, paint-splattered apartment, Brian's hands trembled as he stared at the torn pieces of his latest sketch. Tito stood over him, arms crossed, a harsh light reflecting off the walls. "You really think she's going to pick you? A broke artist with no plan. Face reality, man." Brian clenched his jaw but didn't respond. He stuffed the torn paper into the trash, his heart heavier than the pile of failed dreams around him. "Maybe she deserves better," he finally muttered. Back in her office, Kezia closed her laptop and stood, walking over to the window. The city lights looked cold tonight, but inside her, something was burning, a desire to break free from the expectations and live honestly. She pulled out the sketch Brian had given her, smoothing the charcoal lines with trembling fingers. It was imperfect, raw, and somehow beautiful, just like what she wanted for herself. Later that evening, Kezia found herself standing outside a small art gallery she hadn't planned to visit. Inside, the walls were lined with paintings, some vibrant, others hauntingly simple. And there, on the far wall, was Brian's work. A portrait of her, eyes soft and unguarded, surrounded by color and light. She felt the room tilt as he stepped out from the shadows, eyes searching hers. "You came," he said quietly. She nodded. "I had to see what you see when you look at me." He smiled, hope flickering in his gaze. "Then maybe we can learn to see the world through each other's eyes." They didn't speak for a moment. The world didn't ask them to. But when the music swelled in the gallery behind them, Brian whispered, "What happens when reality catches up?" Kezia smiled faintly. Then we teach it how to dream again. The following weeks became a quiet rebellion against everything that had once kept them apart. Kezia started leaving her office before sunset, slipping into Brian's small studio tucked between a bookstore and a bakery, where paint stained the floor and jazz never stopped playing. He taught her how to sketch, not for perfection but for freedom. She taught him how to pitch an idea without shrinking, how to believe his talent was worth something. Together, they created a small collection, Dual Light, portraits of people who wore one face in the world and another when alone. Brian painted. Kezia curated. They laughed over spilled wine and argued over frame colors. But they moved together like two people slowly learning to speak the same language. Madame Grace began referring to Kezia as our investor at Salon Mirage, and Myra, after weeks of silent disapproval, finally visited Brian's studio and found herself staring at a self-portrait he'd drawn of her, unfiltered, elegant, unsure. She said nothing but left him a note. "I was wrong. You're exactly what she needed." The exhibition opened in a repurposed loft, small and cozy. Invitations were limited. Brian stood beside Kezia in a crisp white shirt she had picked out, hand in hers as people filed in, some in heels, others in paint-stained boots. No one cared about leagues anymore. The art spoke for itself. The final piece was a split canvas. One half of Kezia's face, one of Brian's. Different colors, different strokes, but joined perfectly in the middle. When a journalist asked, "What inspired this?" Brian looked at Kezia, who answered, "The courage to see and be seen." That night, as the city blinked below them, they sat quietly on his rooftop once again. Backs against the railing, champagne bottle between them. "You know," he murmured, "you ruined my quiet life." She chuckled. "And you ruined my carefully managed one." They clinked glasses. "I think we're better for it," she whispered. A breeze drifted over the rooftop, cool and soft, rustling Kezia's curls as she leaned her head on Brian's shoulder. Below them, the city buzzed, unaware that somewhere above, two people had quietly rewritten their stories. No one had to approve. No board meeting. No client pitch. Just breath, presence, and heartbeats in sync. Brian turned his head slightly, brushing her hair aside. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't walked into that salon?" Kezia smiled. "I'd still be wearing a mask I didn't know I had on." He nodded slowly. "And I'd still be drawing strangers and pretending that was enough." She reached over and took his hand, gently placing it over her heart. No more pretending. The next morning, Brian awoke before her, sunlight slipping through the slats of the blinds and casting golden lines across her sleeping face. He reached for his sketchpad, not wanting to lose the image of her at peace. His pencil moved slowly, reverently. She stirred, eyelids fluttering open. "You're drawing me again?" she asked groggily. "Always," he said. "You're still becoming." She propped herself up on her elbow, watching him. "Let's go away for a few days. Somewhere quiet. No meetings. No emails. Just art and sky." He paused, surprised, but nodded. "I know a place. My aunt's cottage by the lake. No Wi-Fi, lots of stars." "Perfect," she said. They packed light. She brought a journal. He brought brushes. The drive was long, full of music and silence, and glances that didn't need translation. When they arrived, the lake was calm, the trees tall and steady like time had paused just for them. Kezia spent mornings sitting on the porch, legs curled under her, writing thoughts she'd never said out loud. Brian painted the reflections on the water, her silhouette against the window, the way her laugh echoed into the trees. At night, they cooked together badly, burning rice and laughing too hard to care. One night, under a sky smeared with stars, Kezia turned to him, serious for the first time in days. "Are you afraid?" she asked. He looked at her carefully. "Of what?" "That one day we wake up and realize we don't fit again." He shook his head. "We never fit the world's expectations to begin with. That's what makes this real. We get to build our own shape." She kissed him then, deep and sure, as if confirming the truth in his words. When they returned to the city, something had changed, not around them, but inside them. Kezia walked into her next board meeting with the sketch of the split canvas framed in her office. When a colleague raised an eyebrow, she simply smiled. That's what balance looks like. Brian received his first invitation to submit work for a national show. He declined the gallery's offer to reframe his art. It's supposed to look like it came from a kitchen table, he told them. Because it did. Their worlds didn't merge perfectly. Sometimes, her schedule still pulled her away. Sometimes, his self-doubt crept in. But they met in the middle over tea in the morning, over sketches by candlelight. They were different, always would be. But now they moved like melody and harmony separate, yet better together. And in that rhythm, they found something that wasn't defined by class, expectation, or logic. They found a life, a truth, a connection that began in a salon and bloomed into something neither of them had dared to dream. Love that didn't demand sameness, only presence. Only courage. Only heart.